It was leaking fuel. It was built from a metal that didn't exist in America. And it was designed to fly so fast, the pilots had to wear spacesuits just to survive the friction. To the Russians, it was a ghost. To the radar operators watching their screens in terror, it was a UFO. But to the man who built it, it was just a math problem that needed to be solved. History tells us that the United States Air Force dominates the skies with billion-dollar technology, pristine laboratories, and thousands of staff. But the most dangerous aircraft in human history weren't built in a high-tech facility. They were built in a rotting, smelly circus tent next to a plastics factory. They were built by a man who bullied generals, broke every rule in the military handbook, and tricked the Soviet Union into selling him the very metal he used to spy on them. This is the story of the Skunk Works, and it begins not with a plane, but with a fistfight in a muddy schoolyard. Clarence Johnson was not born into power. He was born into the dirt. The son of poor Swedish immigrants in a remote mining town in Michigan, he didn't have connections, and he didn't have money. What he had was a temper. At school, the local kids saw a skinny immigrant boy with a funny accent and decided he was an easy target. They were wrong. Clarence didn't run. He swung. He fought with such ferocious, calculated aggression that the bullies didn't just stop. They gave him a nickname. Kelly. He carried that fighting spirit from the schoolyard into the polite, reserved world of aviation engineering, and he absolutely shattered it. In 1933, Kelly Johnson walked into the Lockheed Corporation. He was 23 years old. In the hierarchy of engineering, he was nobody. His job was to shut up, draw lines, and fetch coffee for the senior men. But Kelly Johnson had a problem. He was allergic to stupidity. On his very first assignment, the chief engineer showed him the pride of the company, the Model 10 Electra airliner. It was beautiful. It was expensive. The company's future depended on it. Kelly took one look at the wind tunnel data and said, "It's garbage." The room went silent. You simply do not tell the chief engineer his plane is garbage. The executives were horrified. They wanted to fire him on the spot. But there was a nagging doubt. What if the kid is right? They sent the model back to the wind tunnel for one more test. The results came back. The kid wasn't just right. He was a genius. The tail was unstable. If they had built it, it would have killed everyone on board. Kelly fixed the design, the Electra became a legend, and Lockheed realized they had accidentally hired a tiger. By 1937, the world was darkening. In Berlin, Hitler was posturing. In the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy was expanding. The U.S. Army needed a fighter plane, but they didn't want just any fighter. They wanted a high-altitude interceptor that could fly at 360 miles per hour and climb like a rocket. The requirements were absurd. Every other aviation company looked at the specs and said, "It can't be done, not with the engines we have." But while others were making excuses, Kelly Johnson was making sketches. He said, "If one engine isn't enough, I'll use two." He designed the P-38 Lightning. It was a radical beast. Instead of a traditional fuselage, it had a central pod for the pilot and guns and two massive booms for the engines. It looked like two planes welded together. Critics called it ugly. They called it a monstrosity. But when it finally took to the air, it didn't just fly, it screamed. It was the first fighter in history to top 400 miles per hour. But speed has a price. The P-38 was so fast that it encountered a deadly new phenomenon that no pilot had ever faced before: compressibility. As the plane approached the speed of sound, the air couldn't move out of the way fast enough. It formed a shock wave over the wings. The controls would freeze solid. The pilot would pull back on the stick with all his strength. But the plane would ignore him. It would nose over and dive straight into the ground, disintegrating on impact. It was a terrifying mystery. The sound barrier wasn't just a wall, it was a graveyard. Kelly Johnson didn't sleep. He worked the problem while the Army panicked. He realized the shock wave was killing the lift. His solution was elegant and simple. Dive flaps, a small metal strip to disrupt the shock wave and give control back to the pilot. While other engineers were guessing, Johnson was calculating. He saved the plane, and the plane saved the war. It was the P-38 Lightning that hunted down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, in a mission flown in total radio silence. It was the plane that broke the back of the Luftwaffe in North Africa. The Germans hated it. They called it the fork-tailed devil. Kelly Johnson had arrived, but 1943 brought a new nightmare. Intelligence reports started trickling in from Europe. Terrified Allied pilots were reporting a German plane that had no propellers. It moved faster than anything they had ever seen. The Messerschmitt 262. The jet age had arrived, and the Allies were not invited. The U.S. Army Air Forces panicked. They realized with horror that they were fighting a jet war with piston engines. They were bringing a knife to a gunfight. If the Germans could mass-produce these jets, the air war over Europe would be lost. Desperate, the Air Force called Lockheed. They needed a jet fighter, and they needed it yesterday. They hauled Kelly Johnson into a meeting room and laid it out. We need a jet prototype to counter the Germans. How long will it take? 2 years? 3 years? Kelly looked at the generals. He didn't blink. He said, "I'll give you a jet in 180 days. The room went dead silent. 180 days was impossible. It takes 180 days just to design the landing gear. It takes years to build an engine. But Johnson had a condition. He said, "I can do it, but you have to leave me alone. No bureaucracy, no inspections, no interference. I pick the team. I pick the hours. And nobody, absolutely nobody, tells me how to run my shop." The general agreed. But there was a catch. Lockheed was fully mobilized for the war effort. Every square inch of the factory floor was busy building bombers. There was physically no space for Kelly's secret project. So, they improvised. Kelly rented a circus tent. He found an old, abandoned machine shop next to a smelly plastics factory in Burbank. The stench was unbearable, a toxic mix of burning plastic and rotting chemicals that hung in the air like a fog. It smelled like death. One of the engineers, wearing a gas mask just to work, made a joke. He answered the ringing phone by saying, "Skunk Works," a reference to a moonshine factory in a popular comic strip. The name stuck. The legend was born. Inside that smelly tent, Kelly Johnson handpicked 23 engineers. The best of the best. He laid down the law. He created the 14 rules of management. Rule number 12. There must be mutual trust between the military and the contractor. Rule number 13. Access by outsiders strictly restricted. He created a cult of speed. The motto was simple. Be quick, be quiet, be on time. The clock was ticking. Every hour wasted was an hour the Germans were unchallenged in the skies. They had no computers. They had no calculators. They had slide rules, pencils, and intuition. They worked 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. Kelly Johnson was everywhere. He was checking rivets. He was shouting at suppliers. He was sweeping the floor. He was a dictator, but his men loved him because he was in the trenches with them. On day 130, the engine finally arrived. It was a British engine, the Goblin, supplied by Frank Whittle's company, because the Americans were still lagging behind in jet tech. On day 143, 37 days ahead of the impossible schedule, the XP-80 shooting star was ready. They towed it out to a dry lake bed in the desert. The sun beat down on the fuselage. The pilot climbed in. The British engine whined to life, a high-pitched scream that sounded like the future. Kelly Johnson stood by the side of the runway, chewing on a cigar. He had bet his entire reputation on this moment. It flew. It was sleek. It was fast. It was the first operational American jet fighter. And it was built in a tent by a bunch of rebels who ignored every rule in the book. The Army was ecstatic. They ordered mass production immediately. But history is cruel. The P-80 arrived just as the war was ending. The Nazis were defeated before the plane could see major combat. But the peace that followed was an illusion. A new enemy was rising in the east, the Soviet Union. The Cold War had begun, and this new war wouldn't be fought with tanks and battalions. It would be fought with secrets. Stalin was building missiles. The Soviets had tested an atomic bomb in 1949, shocking the world. America was blind. President Eisenhower needed eyes inside Russia. He needed to know where the silos were. He needed to know how many bombers they had. But you cannot just fly a plane over Soviet territory. That is an act of war. Unless the plane was flying so high that they couldn't touch it. Enter the CIA. They didn't want a fighter pilot. They wanted a spy. They approached the Air Force with a radical idea. A plane that could fly at 70,000 feet. To put that in perspective, airliners today cruise at 35,000. 70,000 feet is the edge of space. The sky turns black. The curvature of the Earth becomes visible. At that height, Russian radar would struggle to track it, and their missiles would simply run out of fuel trying to reach it. The Air Force engineers said it was physically impossible. The air is too thin to support wings. The engine would choke. It couldn't be done. So, the CIA rang Kelly Johnson. Kelly didn't argue. He simply redesigned the airplane. He took the fuselage of a fighter jet and bolted on massive glider-like wings. He called it the CL-282. The CIA called it the U-2. But there was a massive problem. To reach that altitude, the plane had to be incredibly light. Every gram mattered. Kelly became obsessive. He removed the armor. He removed the ejection seat system. He even removed the landing gear. He designed pogo wheels, stabilizers that fell off the moment the plane took off. To land, the pilot had to balance the plane on a central bicycle wheel, like a circus act. It was dangerous. It was fragile. It was essentially a flying camera made of tinfoil. But where do you test a secret plane that doesn't officially exist? You can't fly it at a public airport. Kelly looked at a map of the Nevada nuclear test grounds. He found a dried-up salt flat called Groom Lake. It was remote. It was hostile. It was perfect. He called it Paradise Ranch to trick the workers into coming. Today, we know it by a different name, Area 51. Kelly Johnson didn't just build the plane, he built the base. In August 1955, the U-2 flew. It climbed to 70,000 feet. The pilots, wearing partial pressure suits because their blood would boil if the cabin depressurized, looked down on the world like gods. For 4 years, the U-2 was invincible. It flew over the Soviet Union with impunity. It photographed bomber bases, missile silos, and submarine yards. The Russians could see it on their radar, ghostly blips moving across the screen. But they could do nothing. Their MiGs would stall trying to reach it. Their missiles exploded miles below. Kelly Johnson had built a ghost. He had given America the ultimate high ground. But technology never stands still. And Kelly knew something the generals didn't. He knew that altitude was a temporary shield. Every day, Soviet missiles were getting faster. Every day, their radar was getting sharper. It was only a matter of time before they reached up and grabbed the U-2 out of the sky. On May 1st, 1960, the nightmare scenario happened. Pilot Francis Gary Powers was flying deep over Sverdlovsk, Russia. He felt safe. He felt untouchable. But the Russians had developed a new missile, the SA-2 guideline. And they didn't just fire one, they fired a barrage. A shock wave from a nearby explosion snapped the U-2's fragile, long wings. The plane disintegrated. Powers didn't die. He bailed out and was captured. It was a geopolitical catastrophe. The United States was caught red-handed spying. The invincible plane lay in pieces in Gorky Park for the world to see. Kelly Johnson watched the news in horror. His creation hadn't failed. Physics had just caught up with him. He realized that the era of hiding in the upper atmosphere was over. If you can't hide up high, there is only one other way to survive. You have to outrun the bullet. The CIA came back to the Skunk Works, terrified. "They can hit us at 70,000 feet, they said. What do we do now?" Kelly Johnson leaned back in his chair. He had already been thinking about this. "We stop floating," he said, "and we start sprinting." He proposed a plane that would fly at Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound. Faster than a rifle bullet. A plane so fast that by the time enemy radar detected it, it would already be gone. But at Mach 3, the friction of the air is so intense that aluminum, the metal all airplanes were made of, would melt like butter. The plane would have to be built out of something else. Something incredibly rare, incredibly hard to work with, and incredibly expensive. Titanium. There was just one problem. The United States didn't have enough titanium, but do you know who did? The Soviet Union. And this is where the story turns from engineering into a spy thriller, because Kelly Johnson was about to pull off the greatest heist in military history. In one of the greatest ironies of the Cold War, the CIA set up a complex network of fake companies across Europe. They posed as civilian firms, manufacturers of pizza ovens and golf clubs. They reached out to Soviet suppliers with a simple request: "We need titanium." The Soviets, eager for foreign currency, agreed. They mined the metal from their own soil, processed it in their own factories, and shipped it quietly to the West. They had no idea that they were selling the very skin of the aircraft that would soon render their entire air defense network obsolete. The Soviet Union was literally digging its own grave, one shipment of titanium at a time. But getting the metal was only the first circle of hell. Working with it was the second. Titanium is incredibly strong, but it is also incredibly stubborn. When Kelly's engineers tried to cut it, their tools shattered. When they tried to drill it, the drill bits melted. They had to invent entirely new manufacturing processes from scratch. They found that even the water in Burbank was a problem. The chlorine in the city water supply was corroding the welds, so they had to truck in distilled water. Then there was the fuel. At Mach 3, the skin of the plane gets so hot, over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, that standard jet fuel would simply explode in the tanks. Kelly had to ask Shell Oil to invent a new type of fuel, JP7. It was so stable that you could drop a lit match into a bucket of it, and the match would go out. To ignite it inside the engine, they had to inject a chemical called triethylborane, which explodes on contact with air. Kelly Johnson was pushing his team to the absolute breaking point. Marriages fell apart. Engineers slept on the floor under their drafting tables, but they kept going because they knew they weren't just building a plane. They were building a legend. In 1964, the successor to the U-2 was finally ready. It was rolled out onto the tarmac at Area 51. Project Oxcart. The world would soon know it as the SR-71 Blackbird. It looked like a dagger carved out of obsidian. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed in the desert. But as the ground crew prepared it for flight, an observer noticed something horrifying. It was leaking. Fuel was dripping steadily from the bottom of the fuselage, forming puddles on the concrete. To an outsider, it looked like a disaster, a billion-dollar failure. But to Kelly Johnson, it was perfect. You see, this was the genius of his madness. Kelly knew that when the plane hit 3,000 feet per second, the friction of the air would generate massive heat. The titanium panels would expand. If he had built the plane with tight seals on the ground, the expansion in the air would have ripped the fuselage apart. So, he built it loose. He designed the plane to be imperfect on the ground so that it would become perfect in the sky. The fuel tanks only sealed themselves when the metal screamed in agony. The pilot climbed in. He wasn't wearing a leather jacket and goggles. He was wearing a full-pressure spacesuit, identical to what astronauts wore. He was about to leave the world we know. The engines roared, a sound so loud it could crack concrete. The Blackbird accelerated down the runway and tore into the sky. It didn't just climb, it pierced the atmosphere. At 85,000 feet, the sky above the pilot turned pitch black. He could see the curvature of the Earth. He was flying at the edge of space, at 3 times the speed of sound. At that speed, you are traveling faster than the rotation of the Earth. There is a famous story of a Blackbird pilot who took off from London after lunch. He flew west toward Los Angeles. Because he was outrunning the sun, he watched the sun rise in the west. He landed in California before he had taken off in London. He literally flew back in time. But the SR-71 wasn't built for sightseeing. It was built for war. And the Soviet Union was waiting. When the Blackbird first violated Soviet airspace, the radar operators couldn't believe their eyes. The blip on the screen was moving at 2,200 miles per hour. It was impossible. Panic set in. They alerted the missile batteries. Fire! Fire everything! The SA-2 missiles launched. These were the same missiles that had destroyed the U-2. They accelerated to Mach 3, hunting for the heat of the Blackbird's engines. In any other plane, the pilot would have to dive, bank, or deploy countermeasures. But inside the SR-71, the standard operating procedure for a missile attack was terrifyingly simple. There were no fancy maneuvers. There was no evasion. When the missile launch warning light flashed red in the cockpit, the pilot simply pushed the throttle forward. The Blackbird would accelerate. The missile, traveling at its maximum velocity, would try to intercept. But the plane was simply moving too fast. The geometry didn't work. The missile would chase the ghost, run out of fuel, and fall helplessly back to Earth. Over 4,000 missiles were fired at the SR-71 Blackbird during its service life. Do you know how many hit it? 0. Kelly Johnson had solved the missile problem with brute force physics. He had built the only aircraft in human history that could outrun a bullet. But building the ultimate plane took a toll. Kelly ran the Skunk Works like a dictator. He was famous for his nickel tour. If an engineer made a careless mistake that threatened the safety of a pilot, Kelly wouldn't yell. He would walk up to the man, reach into his pocket, flip a nickel onto his desk, and say, "Call your wife. Tell her you've been fired." He was brutal. He was demanding. But his team loved him because he protected them. When the Air Force generals tried to interfere with the design, Kelly threw them out of his office. When the bureaucrats in Washington tried to cut the budget or demand paperwork, Kelly threatened to quit. He built a wall around his engineers so they could do the impossible without being suffocated by red tape. He proved that a small group of dedicated people, left alone in a tent, could outperform a massive government bureaucracy every single time. As the 1970s rolled in, the world changed again. Radar technology was getting better. Satellites were beginning to take over the job of spying. Kelly Johnson, now aging, looked at the future and realized that the era of faster and higher was ending. Speed was no longer enough. The next era would be invisible. Before he retired, he laid the groundwork for the next revolution: stealth. He passed the torch to his protege, Ben Rich, who would go on to build the F-117 Nighthawk using the same principles Kelly had instilled in the team. Kelly Johnson retired in 1975. He had designed 40 aircraft. He had won every aviation award in existence. He had advised presidents. But without the pressure, without the deadlines, without the smell of jet fuel and titanium, he faded. He once said, "I'll design an airplane for you, but I won't suffer fools." In retirement, he watched as the aviation industry became bloated, slow, and bureaucratic. Everything he hated. The man who built a jet fighter in 143 days watched in disgust as new planes took 20 years to develop. In 1990, the U.S. Air Force decided to retire the SR-71 Blackbird. It was too expensive to maintain, and satellites could now do the job. On its final flight, the Blackbird was ordered to fly from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. to be delivered to the Smithsonian Museum. The pilots decided to push the throttles one last time. It tore across the entire North American continent. It crossed the United States in 64 minutes. The average speed was 2,124 miles per hour. As it landed, the pilots walked out of the cockpit, their suits steaming in the cool air, and handed the flight log to the museum curator. The ink was still wet. Kelly Johnson died that same year. It was as if he and his greatest creation were tied together by an invisible string. When the bird stopped flying, the master stopped breathing. Today, if you visit the Smithsonian, you can stand under the Blackbird. You can see the titanium skin that rippled at Mach 3. You can see the leak points where the fuel used to drip. It looks like science fiction. It looks like something that shouldn't exist. But it wasn't built by aliens. It wasn't built by a committee. It was built by a poor boy from Michigan who refused to listen to the word impossible. Kelly Johnson didn't just build planes, he built the future. And he did it in a tent, with a slide rule and a promise. Be quick, be quiet, and be on time. If you want to uncover more lost stories from the war that changed the world, make sure you subscribe to www.2 Missing Pages. We are digging up the files that history tried to burn. Click that button, turn on notifications, and I'll see you in the next briefing. Dismissed.